Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti, signore e signori. Welcome everyone to our beginning of the new academic year. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all and introduce our first BSA lecture and the commencement of our public events program for 2022-2023. It's an absolute delight to have you all here, a bit of a blockbuster audience at the BSR, as well as all of those tuning in online from the UK and elsewhere across the globe, with what I'm very excited to say is our incredible new state-of-the-art hybrid setup, which will enable us to continue offering hybrid events through 2022 and 23, where we left off, providing a higher quality experience here live from the BSR. My name is Emlyn Dodd. I'm the Assistant Director here at the BSR, and I'm very excited to introduce tonight's lecture by our phenomenal colleague and our Director, Abigail Brundin, in what is a well-deserved celebration of her first year in post at the BSR. Before I introduce Abigail, a very brief reminder to those in person here and those online. Please be aware that tonight's lecture is being recorded. And secondly, for those online, we encourage you to ask any and all questions you might have by writing them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for those here in person, you're welcome to ask questions after the lecture. Of course, you can raise your hand and we will bring a microphone around to you. So this evening, Abigail will not only be celebrating her one-year anniversary, but she'll also be spending some time speaking on the social life of texts in Renaissance Italy. She'll take us on a journey across her research career, spanning the reception and readership of texts from high courtly poetry to scraps worn on the bodies of illiterate workmen across the many modes of text use in the first decades of print. Abigail, as we all know, has published widely on the literature and the culture of Italy in the Renaissance and early modern periods, with an emphasis on women writers and especially her pioneering work on Vittorio Colonna. She's won prestigious grants, including £2.4 million for the ERC Synergy-funded Domestic Devotions Project. She's amassed book prizes and contributed to major exhibitions, including Madonnas and Miracles at the Fitzwilliam Museum. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight and our director of the BSR, Abigail Brundin.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Emlyn, for a very warm introduction. I've got to the age where I can't see with my glasses on or off. So I'm going to go with off, but I may change my mind partway through. So I am delighted to be here. I can't quite believe that I'm a year in. It's amazing to be standing in front of you at the end of my first year as director here at the British School at Rome. In a way, it's incredible that a whole year has passed. In a way, I feel as if I've always been here, and I certainly feel that I'm in the right place. This first year's been stimulating, challenging, often unexpected, but the key thing, always fun. I've stretched my brain into new shapes in order to meet head-on some of the challenges of this incredibly interdisciplinary environment and the richness that that offers. And I felt brain synapses, if such a thing even exists, zinging back into life, or perhaps new ones connecting that I never knew existed. So the first thing to say, and this isn't just a form of polite words, this is really a heartfelt thanks, the warmest of warm thanks, first and foremost to my wonderful colleagues here in Rome and in London, and also to all the many other BSR stakeholders and friends internationally who've given me such a warm welcome and have challenged me and supported me and made this year such a pleasure. I've become part, it's very clear, of a huge and dedicated international family, and I'm looking forward to continuing our work together over the next few years. So this evening, though, I am appearing before you not in the guise of director of the BSR, but in the guise of a researcher. I think I used to be one. And so I'm endeavoring to put my money where my mouth is and show you some evidence of those newly reactivated synapses that I just mentioned. We'll see what happens. I'm particularly pleased, in fact, that it has been possible, even during my first year in the job, while I get to grips with the day-to-day management of the BSR, and that's been front and center of my mind, to find time for my own work. I have written a new article here this year, although I'm not going to be talking about that tonight. Inevitably, though, a year in a new job in a new country has been quite demanding. So I thought that what I'd offer tonight, instead of talking about new work, is an overview of a research trajectory and try to stand back from that and think about why I've ended up where I've ended up. So I hope this evening to take you on a journey. It's the same journey that I've been on academically and intellectually over the last 20 years. And it's taken me in a rather unexpected direction. It's taken me from the very highest court culture of the 16th century to town squares and street corners and conversations amongst illiterate and poor individuals. And it's taken me from the refined genre of the Petrarchan lyric poem to scraps of semi-doggerel verse printed in cheap paper pamphlets or on pieces of paper. In a sense, taking you on this academic journey with me this evening is also something of a Proustian journey of self-discovery, and I'll explain why. So some years ago, I was applying for an ERC grant that Emlyn mentioned with 2 colleagues. We were going to be 3 PIs on this grant, and we were needing to tick a box on the form that defined our disciplinary identity. And my colleagues very immediately and unproblematically ticked the boxes, we'll come to her in a minute, describing themselves as, in one case, a cultural and social historian, and in the other case, an architectural historian. We couldn't find a box for me. We spent some time discussing it. I got a little bit upset. In the end, we decided to tick a sort of hybrid box that described me as a purveyor of literary studies. But I felt this was a less than satisfactory outcome. The term felt a bit flabby, felt a bit unexciting. It lacked the concreteness of my colleagues' disciplinary titles. It ignored my specialism in the language of my place of study. It also ignored the fact that an awful lot of what I work on could never be described as literature. And what's more, it didn't provide me with a scholarly identity. My colleagues' labels did. They could be cultural historians or architectural historians. I didn't really want to be a literary student. So what, in fact, am I? So part of what I'm trying to do this evening is illustrate a methodology for you as it has evolved over the 2 decades that I've been working with it and within it, from within the discipline of modern languages, which is the discipline that I come from. That is my home department at the University of Cambridge. And maybe by the end of this evening's journey, we will come up with a disciplinary identity that I can then use the next time I have to tick a box. In a sense, this is a question that a lot of us who come from the discipline of modern languages are asking ourselves at the moment. Colleagues in the United Kingdom have been thinking, talking, and writing about this very difficulty. And trying to understand or trying to articulate more clearly for other audiences what it is that we bring to the table, methodologically speaking, that is different and valuable, and how to account for it. So in a sense, that's part of what I'm trying to do this evening. So I began my academic life working on Vittoria Colonna, the highly aristocratic Roman poet, the widow laureate, as you can see in this slightly lugubrious portrait from Palazzo Colonna, where her dark widow's dress and her laurel crown are clearly in evidence. Colonna was renowned in her lifetime for the production of lyric poetry, and she established a model for literary production by secular women that was beyond reproach and hugely successful. So clearly this is literary studies, no problem so far. Vittoria Colonna was a huge publishing phenomenon in her lifetime. And I apologize to those of you who know a huge amount about Vittoria Colonna, and there are some of you present in the room this evening, but many of you will not know her because she is the best example of what's been termed a strong voice and a weak history. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So a huge publishing phenomenon in her century. Her poetry went through numerous 16th century editions, the first edition in 1538. She was highly respected by other poets of her generation and after, not because she was a woman writing, although that was also remarkable, but because she was an excellent writer, and her command and control of an incredibly difficult genre, the genre of the Petrarchan lyric poem, was considered to be extremely high. She had the ability as well to carve out a space inside this genre for a female voice. She effectively revolutionized the genre in order to create a way for women to speak through that mode. And she also turned it directly to the service of some of the most pressing religious questions of her period that concerned her very deeply. So as I said, the first edition of Vittorio Colonna's poetry was printed in 1538. It was also notably the first edition of the collected poetry of any woman writer in Italy. So it was absolutely groundbreaking, this work. And the poems went on to be published in a further 13 editions before her death in 1547, and a further 9 editions before the end of the 16th century. So that's a pretty remarkable print trajectory. She was also published numerous times in individual and groups of poems that appeared in the anthologies of lyric verse that were a very popular feature of 16th century print publishing, and her poetry was regularly set to music by composers of the age. So this is really an astonishing sort of print history, reception history, dissemination history for any writer of the 16th century, let alone a woman writer. But as I said, a strong voice, a weak history. That's the title of an excellent volume of essays from some years ago by some colleagues who were sort of pioneering in thinking about women's literary production in the Renaissance. And it fits Colonna perfectly, a strong voice, a weak history. After the end of her own century, her renown waned, her poetry fell out of print, and by the 19th century, she was chiefly remembered in this kind of commemorative genre as the friend and muse of Michelangelo. So she was, in fact, a close friend of Michelangelo Buonarroti, and that became her sort of calling card. That became the way in which she was remembered, a largely silent figure, but a figure who inspired poetry in somebody else. In a sense, that was, well, in every way, that was a complete distortion of the nature of the friendship between Vittorio Colonna and Michelangelo. She was very much the dominant partner in that friendship and the kind of leading voice. So it's interesting how the reception flipped that. And that was in large part in order to find a female figure to place in conversation with Michelangelo in the sort of difficult 19th century reception of his own poetry. A brief anecdotal aside, while we're talking about this, it was my early work on Vittorio Colonna that first brought me to the British School at Rome. So sometime in the late 1990s, I was working on my doctorate at Cambridge, and I came to Rome one summer to consult material in the Vatican Library and in the Archivio Segreto, as it was known then, and a couple of people in the room who I think I met on that trip. I made some connections during that stay that are still active today and have been absolutely fundamental to my academic journey subsequently. I was also robustly supported by my colleagues here at the BSR when I melted into tears over dinner after about 4 days of useless work in the Archivio Segreto and explained to my dinner companions that I didn't know how to use the catalogue, at which point the next day one of them came with me to the Archivio and talked me through it and put me back on my feet. And I think that is the essence of what a scholarly community should be. The ability to express your need and to have other people meet you and help you with it. I also, upstairs in the little computer room that used to be above the dining room, logged into my, probably then in the late 90s, brand new email account and found a message from the editor of a journal accepting my first scholarly article for publication. So this is a very important place for me in all kinds of ways, as I'm sure it is for many of you. So coming back to the topic in hand, at the time of that first visit to the BSR, I was working on Vittorio Colonna, as I said. I was studying her beautiful handling of the sonnet form, and I was concentrating in particular on a manuscript gift of sonnets that she put together for Michelangelo in around 1540, which is in the Vatican Library, that you can see here on the left of the slide. I was convinced of the quality and significance of Vittorio Colonna's poetry. I was a bit bemused by the lack of attention to her in the wider scholarship. I told a couple of people I was working on Colonna and they sort of said, oh, she's a bit boring, which isn't true. And I'm happy to say that that neglect has been entirely reversed now. There's a large crowd of really excellent younger scholars now working, ploughing this furrow, working on Colonna and working on all her sister writers from the period. So we've traveled a long way in 20 years. But I was also becoming increasingly aware as I worked on her of a sort of parallel phenomenon that took me by surprise. And this is that from the very earliest editions in print of Vittorio Colonna's poetry, there was a strong market and demand for it at a far more popular level than I was expecting. That is far lower down the social scale, not in quality large format editions, in cheap, small, pocket-sized versions, in Baudelarized anthology texts, etc. Colonna's poetry, as I've said, has its origins in the Italian courts. It's a difficult genre. It requires supreme poetic control from the practitioner. It also requires effort on the part of the reader, as my own students in Cambridge will attest when they complained when I made them read it as part of their course of study in Cambridge. Nonetheless, it was rapidly adopted and disseminated in the cheap print market immediately following that first edition of 1538. My colleague in Switzerland, Tatiana Crivelli, who's written the definitive account of Colonna's print history, notes this phenomenon in particular. She notes the inclusion of very cheap printed editions of the poetry alongside large numbers of Colonna's works in popular anthologies. And she points to this kind of parallel modes of dissemination of her work, the high end and the popular routes, the latter operating at one remove from the high aristocratic author herself. Now, Colonna herself makes very clear in her poetry that she expects to be read, that she needs to be read, she demands to be read. She writes of her poetry as sparks issuing forth from her despite herself, and her gratitude if one of them should manage to inflame somebody's heart. Dal fuoco divin, che il mio intelletto sua mercé infiamma, convien che scanfore mal mio grado talor queste faville, these sort of sparks, these scintillas, e s'alcun di loro un gentil core avvien che scaldi, if one of them should set on fire a gentle heart, mille volte mille ringraziar debo il mio felice errore. So I must thank that happy accident 1,000 times. So if I should happen, because this poetry comes out of me anyway and I can't stop it, to set someone else on fire with it, that is the best of accidents. She also, in her very famous opening sonnet of her spiritual collection, describes the way that she's going to use the blood of the crucifixion as her ink, the nails as her pens, the body of Christ as her paper, in order to write for others all that he suffered. I santi chiodi sian le mie penne, puro inchiostro il prezioso sangue, vergata carto il sacro corpo ex sangue, si che io scriva ad altrui quel che sostiene. So she's writing for other people. She's making it very clear. This is an engaged poetic enterprise. Her poetry needs an audience, in other words. So what I wanted to understand was, not least in order to be able to explain it to my own students and persuade them that the effort was worth their time, was what was the reader getting from Vittorio Colonna's poetry, particularly the popular reader, if we can use that term, or the ordinary reader, whoever that might be. What was the appeal? So a glimpse of an answer to this question started to present itself when I traveled, I think with my entire family, including 3 small children in tow, to Padua to look at a pamphlet. That's the kind of thing that the children of academics get very used to, isn't it? These random journeys across foreign countries in search of some piece of evidence. And luckily, because they're children, they think it's entirely normal and to be expected, and they come along and enjoy themselves. My youngest, who's quite old now, used to stop outside every church and say, "Aren't we going in?" So anyway, I dragged my family to Padua to look at a pamphlet, strange but true, which I had come across a mention of in a wonderful book about cheap print by Rosa Salzberg, which survives in a sole copy in the Biblioteca Universitaria in Padua. And this is a small pamphlet printed in Brescia in 1538, the same year that that first edition of Vittorio Colonna's collected poetry was printed. It's a pamphlet by an author called Pietro da Luca, but it's been misattributed, I'm sure entirely deliberately, to Cherubino da Spoleto. And I wanted to consult the work because, as you can see from the slide, it's dedicated to Vittorio Colonna, to the most illustrious Signora, Vittoria Dignissima, Marchesa di Pescara, Marchesa of Pescara, that was her married title. I wanted to understand why, given there was no obvious connection with the author, this cheap pamphlet was citing her in this way. This isn't a pamphlet of poetry. It's a short, sort of Bowdlerized work offering advice to widows on how to lead a spiritual life. It's 24 sheets long, dense type, cheap paper in ottavo format, and it was put together by a pamphlet seller who was active in the Veneto region in this period, known as Ippolito Ferrarese. It's a very pragmatic work. It offers advice to widows on how to live a good Christian life, urging them to keep virtuous company, to adopt modesty in dress, to practice generosity to the poor, nothing particularly unexpected. So we have the dedication to Vittorio Colonna on the title page, and inside the pamphlet, a dedicatory letter which alludes to a relationship between the poet Colonna and the pamphlet seller Ippolito Ferrarese. So Ippolito presumes to offer Vittorio Colonna advice in his dedication on how to use his pamphlet in her personal devotional reading. He says his work must be read at least once a month and acted on as closely as possible. Notably, the pamphlet also contains a markedly apotropaic element, horrible word, incredibly useful, but I suppose an activating, spiritual activating element, explaining that for my son in the back row, in a final section which contains this long prayer, as well as a rubric that instructs the reader on how to use the prayer, and it contains the rubric, whoever says this prayer, kneeling with a blessed candle in their hand for a period of 40 days will receive all legitimate graces from the Virgin Mary. So what's going on in this cheap pamphlet? The connection with Vittorio Colonna has clearly been invented by the pamphlet seller. It seems highly unlikely that Vittorio Colonna ever owned a copy of this cheap pamphlet. She could afford much nicer books than this, and she kept much better company than the lowly Ceretano Ippolito Ferrarese. So on an obvious level, it's being used to sell the work, associating a pamphlet on widowhood with an extremely famous widow, an aristocratic figure, herself a writer. But the unsolicited advice to consult this work at least once a month that Ippolito offers to Vittorio Colonna in the opening, as well as the prayer and the rubric with specific instructions for usage and spiritual impact, alert us that there's something more going on here as well. At least some part of the intended readership of this pamphlet will include individuals who want to own the text because in some way it's going to change them. So they want a text with perceived protective or intercessory qualities that go beyond any straightforward act of reading. The rubric's instructions notably say, kneel and pray and light and hold a candle. So the pamphlet is drawn into a relationship with very different territory where it assumes the properties of an effective devotional object. And reading changes its nature and becomes something rather interesting and different. So Ippolito Ferrarese was, of course, not the first or last canny seller of cheap print to spot the market potential of harnessing the power of the new print technology to sell a product that promises some kind of intercessory or apotropaic function. On the slide here, you've got one of the lovely items. It was the smallest and least kind of spectacular thing that we brought to Cambridge for our exhibition some years ago. And for me, the most exciting and the one that generated the most discussion when I took people on tours of the exhibition, because it's such a rare survival. This small printed breve, it's really very small. But it must have been an absolutely major and fundamental plank of the cheap printing industry in the period, very quickly consumed, rarely surviving because it was worn on bodies, kissed, clutched, even eaten in order to harness the power of the written word that it contained as directly as possible. Notably, and this is an important sort of side point that's been made by other scholars before me, but what we tend to consult in libraries today and have access to in large numbers, and therefore tend to consume, at least in my field, as representing the major planks of, Renaissance literary production, may have been the books that nobody read because so many of them survive in pristine copies. I guess this is a kind of archaeological problem, I realize now that I'm spending time with archaeologists. So what we're looking at here is a cheap printed breve with prayers on both sides promising protection, direct protection. On one side, it offers protection against fevers, storms, earthquakes, plague, and then on the other side, a prayer to help you find lost or stolen property. So for a very small piece of printed text, it really packs a punch. Notably, you can see where the text has been folded to make a little packet, indicating, and I hope my archaeology colleagues are proud of me for producing some archaeological evidence on a slide for this lecture, indicating that it's been folded to be placed in a pouch, worn on the body in the same mode as we can see here in a cloth pouch with devotional paper contents that was disinterred from a crypt near Modena. So these items are obviously not a new invention in this period. They haven't been invented for the printing industry or by the printing industry. They've existed for centuries, but what we see is the new technology swiftly being harnessed in order to disseminate them much more widely. Printed brevi like this one take their place alongside other kinds of cheap devotional printed works, including prayer sheets like these, notably also including apotropaic or intercessory elements. So the prayer of St. Paul on the left, notably this prayer, which helps particularly to cure bites, including from rabid animals, is to be used alongside a piece of the stone of St. Paul, which is ground and mixed with water or wine. And presumably whoever's selling this pamphlet is also selling the stone of St. Paul, which is a form of Maltese clay, so that you can buy the cure and the printed text together. Or on the other side, a prayer to the Holy Cross, which offers protection against earthquakes and sudden death. The thing I've always thought in looking at these kinds of items is it gives you a good idea of what people were afraid of in this period, which I think is probably worthy of a study of its own. And then a very wide selection of printed pamphlets offering text and advice, a huge growth industry in the latter half of the 16th century after the Council of Trent. So what we have here is a vast production of and market for text that does something, text that can be activated in a particular way, ultimately in the service of spiritual improvement, spiritual benefit for the reader or consumer. And it really interested me to find Vittoria Colonna, the high culture aristocratic poet, also being associated with this low form of textual consumption, suggesting that her words were consumed not only for reasons of literary taste or enjoyment, although presumably also for those reasons, but also because, given their spiritual subject matter, they could be applied. They had a direct, applicable function for the consumer. And this is fascinating to me because it points to a way in which we might have fundamentally misread a literary genre by missing its embeddedness in questions of spiritual efficacy and effect, and only reading it as literature. So I'll cycle back now to my earlier question about readers. That is, these new communities of ordinary people who are seemingly consuming Vittoria Colonna's work or other work in association with her or other kinds of cheap printed matter. What can we find out about these readers and their use of texts? I used this image, I chose this image as the image for this lecture this evening, this wonderful painting by Lavinia Fontana showing a family group. But notably, the main reason why I chose it for inclusion then got cropped off in the brochure that landed in your inboxes, because I chose it because of the item in the bottom, which you didn't see at all, which is the book that is being held open by the girl. So the little girl's holding a small book. The layout of the book and the clasps on the binding suggest very strongly that that's a book of hours, a prayer book. And notably, she's not reading from it. She's holding it open. She's got her finger marking the page. She's got her hand on her heart. She's demonstrating for us a mode of consumption or absorption of the contents of that book. And she's sort of publicly sharing the benefits with those people around her who don't hold the book but stand close to the book. As her family members gather round. So this is a really interesting image because the manner in which the book is being consumed is portrayed in a really interesting way. It's a form of reading that's taking place, but it's a performative reading. It's a communal activity. It's actively devotional, and the book is acting as a prompt The girl holds it open, her finger marks the place, but she doesn't need to look at it. She looks elsewhere. So it isn't acting directly as a text to be deciphered because it's already well known. Probably everybody there knows exactly what the contents of that page are and how to reproduce them and recite them. So I've written elsewhere, drawing on the work of other scholars than me, particularly the work of Paul Sanger, about how we need to expand our categories of what we mean by readers in the Renaissance period. So expand our categories of analysis, because the term literacy is a very baggy concept in this period. You have readers of a traditional kind, what we would recognize today as literate people, people with what Sanger calls comprehension literacy, people who can read silently word by word and follow the words on the page and build precise meaning and understand the grammatical structures of the text they read. So that's one kind of reader, and that's the least prevalent kind of reader in this period. But there's another kind of reader, a reader that has what Paul Sanger calls phonetic literacy. And that's a reader who can voice a text aloud that they know well, perhaps relying on a prompt on a page, a few letters, a few words, a familiar kind of assemblage, perhaps relying on rote memorization so that a familiar word sets in chain a whole set of remembered text. This is how I passed my Latin GCSE. The translation paper was basically recognizing a word and then being able to recite Virgil's Aeneid from that word onwards. It's terrible, not a way to. But anyway, now I know that I was practicing a form of Renaissance literacy, so I feel better about it. This is exactly how children learned to read in the period, using the texts of Latin prayers in books of hours. They might not understand the text, but they knew how to recite it. So it became a point of departure for recognizing the letters on the page. So a phonetic literacy, interestingly, tends to derive from Latin in this period and not from the language that might be being used in the day-to-day. And of course, it derives from devotional context, first and foremost. So we have to imagine a large community of readers of devotional material who know how to activate that material. They know how to activate it via a few familiar letters or words. They have a strong spiritual motivation to activate it, to read it. And now, after the invention of the printing press, they have access, unprecedented access to text of their own. So once we move into the realm of phonetic literacy, the status of the book changes. You can just hold it or place it close by on a prayer stool, for example, as in Bassano's beautiful painting of a woman at her devotions, where the prayer book is not even opened, it's closed on the prayer stool, but clearly all the accoutrements of her prayer have been gathered together in one place. Someone might position themselves close to someone else's text in order to participate in a communal act of reading and recitation, for example, while working, as in this lovely Ceruti image, wrong period, but such a beautiful explication of how a communal act of reading might take place in another setting. So the girl reads from the devotional text while her companions get on with lace making. And indeed, the conduct books of the period recommend precisely this activity. Juan Luis Vives, in his Education of a Christian Woman, tells his readers that it's excellent practice, and I quote, before going out to Mass, to read the Gospel and Epistle of the day at home and a commentary. And after assisting at the Mass, when you return home and have tended to your domestic chores, read something from the Scriptures with a calm and tranquil spirit, if you know how to read. And if you don't, listen. So including that caveat seems very striking. And reading in this manner becomes a communal activity, a group activity, an activity that bleeds into other areas of life. A very few texts in circulation can lead to many readers. And the potency invested in the texts themselves is increased by the fact that many other looser kinds of readers are motivated to participate, to draw close, to listen, to join in the text that they know, to invest in the text the power to change them as part of that community for the better. So in this way, we can see how printed texts continue to act in much the same way as manuscripts acted in the earlier centuries, but that the printed word allows access to the potency of that text to filter down to a lower social level for the first time, where the written word had not previously been so readily available. I realize in Rome, which is covered in words, that this needs some thought, and I need to talk to my classical colleagues to understand how you moved through Rome in the ancient period and were impacted by words that you couldn't read but that you saw every day, because it seems to me to be a really interestingly comparable context. So what methods can we use to gain information about this group of phonetic readers? So an obvious route that my historian colleagues on our grant recommended and spearheaded is to try to track ownership and consumption of books via archival records such as household inventories. Many historians in many different regions over many years have done this with limited success. If you insist on studying inventories, you're left with the impression that no one in Renaissance Italy, with a few notable examples in Venice and Florence, had any books at all. And in fact, this has been pointed out back in 1997 by the historian of religion, Giuliola Fragnito, who said that household inventories are actually a very limited usefulness in tracking questions of book ownership in the Renaissance period. So we did do quite a lot of this as part of the project that I was involved in Cambridge, and we tended to only glimpse books in households. We glimpsed books that most often when they were listed weren't named, weren't classified, were undifferentiated. Some books, some holy books, a few books and papers, presumably because simply too low in value to be worth the time of the person compiling the inventory to pause. They would pause if the book was in a fine binding with some value associated. So that was one approach. As a literary student, that's probably not my first approach. Another approach that can help add depth to the picture of ownership and consumption of books is by looking for annotations. What can annotations tell us about the practices of different readers, how they engaged with their books? Via annotations, we can try to spot patterns across multiple copies of a genre of a book. And I've started doing that with prayer books and with vernacular Bibles, for example, as the most ubiquitous books in Italian homes in the period. In order to draw kind of broad conclusions from that sort of study, you need an awful lot of data, though kind of need a team. William Sherman's wonderful study of the phenomenon of marking books in the English Renaissance points out the frustrating fact that in most cases, when you find readers' annotations, you don't really find out much about the reader. They don't tend to leave us autobiographical insights of the kinds that we're desperate to find in this sort of study. But the evidence is nonetheless fun and suggestive. So I thought I'd just pull a little bit out from some work I've done in the past. So for example, in a beautiful copy of the Meditations of the Life of Christ in the University Library in Cambridge, two nuns marking their names and making a claim to ownership and identity. Alessia, who's clearly a very educated girl with a beautiful italic hand, gives us her name and tells us how she came to own this book and when it was given to her by her uncle Pietro, a Dominican friar. And then somebody far less educated with a less beautiful hand, maybe somebody who's been passed on the book in the convent, makes a strident declaration of self-definition and notes herself as a servant of Christ. So these moments are exciting, even though they're so brief and fragmentary, also because these are women, which is unusual. Or, I like this one very much, a kind of messy, battered psalter, again from the University Library in Cambridge, where a naughty owner, presumably quite a young one, judging by the title page, has cheered up his text with little faces as he went through. So presumably wasn't concentrating on the job in hand, but thinking about something else. So again, a sort of glimpse, an autobiographical moment, sort of spinning through the ages to grab you, but you can't go much beyond what you find here. One of my favorite examples, extremely unprepossessing starting point. I have to thank my colleague Mary Lavin in Cambridge for persevering and going through this text for me, despite what she found when she called it up. This is really interesting because this is really striking evidence of a form of communal reading, in my view. So this is a very battered, as you can see, copy of the life of St. Catharine of Siena, dating probably from the early 15th century. In fact, this is a manuscript, so I'm slightly cheating here because, but I want to show this idea of reading together. It's in the Biblioteca Comunale in Ascoli Piceno, and the saint's life has been annotated throughout the text by a reader who hasn't written things, but instead has come up with a system of marginal drawings or marginal marks in order to locate specific bits of the text. So when the text discusses Catherine's mystical marriage, in the margins you see a ring. And when the text discusses diabolical interventions, excuse the out of focus photos, you get, I think, a flagell, a whip. That's what it looks like to me. Maybe it's a pitchfork. I think it's a whip. And then the references to a spiritual ascension and out-of-body experiences, you get a bird, a dove, representing the Holy Spirit in this case. So a sort of form of pictorial annotation in the margins of this text, which could be used by members of a textual community with varying degrees of literacy. The text is transcribed in a beautiful, clear hand. It's in the vernacular, but if those reading conditions are too hard even for you, then you can pick out the important passages through these pictograms, and perhaps you can use those as a jumping off point for reciting things that you remember, having perhaps listened to a communal reading of the text. And this hypothesis becomes much more compelling when we find in the back of the manuscript that it belonged to a community of tertiary nuns, whose names are listed in the back. And the marginal drawings then seem particularly appropriate for a group of women readers, perhaps with low levels of comprehension literacy. Also, of course, the life of St. Catherine of Siena, particularly close to them and their experiences, herself illiterate. So by marking the important passages of the work with symbols, the text value can be unlocked for as many readers as possible, far beyond the limits imposed by what we might understand to be literacy. So this seems to me a very rare glimpse of a textual community at work. But as I said, these glimpses are few and far between. You can spend weeks and weeks in a library and find none, and they can be difficult to interpret. And it's not easy to build a picture of readers through annotations beyond a kind of mosaic of tiny fragments. The other place where you find traces of readers is when reading goes wrong in the trial records. So in these sources, the presence of the right kind of reading can act as a confirmation of orthodoxy. So in the case, this is purely illustrative because it's a woman with a book, but in the trial of Angelica, accused of witchcraft in Pesaro in 1586, a witness steps up to defend her and testifies that that woman, Angelica, even though she's lame and walks with a stick very slowly, gets herself as best she can to St. Nicholas to hear Mass and say her prayers. In the manner fitting for a good Christian, she always is there with great reverence, and she holds her Book of Hours and her rosary in her hands. So a performative ownership of the right kind of book is used in the trial to insist upon Angelica's innocence. Most of the trial records, you find text behaving in the opposite way. So text leading people into trouble. The Inquisitional archives are littered with readers who've gone astray and read, often in the loosest possible ways, the wrong kinds of text, or read texts in the wrong kinds of ways. So we find, and here again, an illustrative slide of where a text might lead you. So Giovanni Battista Previtello tells his inquisitors at his trial in Venice in 1543 that he listened to a book being read outside a shop in the street and then told his neighbor about what he'd heard. And he never imagined that the book he was listening to was by a certain Martin Luther. Another chap, Giovanni Mion, on trial in Venice in 1588, admits that the sheet of paper that the inquisitors present to him in the trial does indeed belong to him. Yes, it has devotional words and images on it. He bought it from a priest, he tells them, and he wears it close to his body. He says, I wore it for protection against attack because he told me if I wore it, I would never be injured. When the inquisitors ask him what it says, Mion testifies that he doesn't know. He says, I can't read, but I like to look at the pictures from time to time. And then he laments his illiteracy. What a thing it is not to know one's letters. Or we have Isabella from Pesaro, carcerata per un libro, the trial record says, imprisoned because of a book, on trial in 1579, also claiming not to be able to read the book that she is in her possession. She says she picked it up in the street, that it was dropped by another woman, that she took it home and put it in a box together with a piece of lace and some melon seeds. This inexplicable decision to do this with her book is not convincing to the inquisitors, who are sure that there must be some kind of magical practice associated. So through these kinds of records, we are made aware of the democratizing impact of the printed word in this period. It's giving the poor and the uneducated access to text in tangible ways that are deployed in the main in order to activate their intercessory functions. And this is essentially mimicking a kind of usage of text that, of course, the wealthy have long had access to in much finer materials at a much higher end of the market. But here we find it activated at the level of the cheapest kinds of print. The potential to go wrong is very high when the meaning of the texts themselves is only poorly understood and their source isn't necessarily authorized. And the church itself is, of course, keenly aware of this, very worried about the problematic, dangerous potential of this newly broadened access to texts and practices of communal sharing of text. When vernacular Bible translations were definitively banned on the Clementine Index in 1596, after a few decades of uncertainty about what to do, the faithful were obliged to denounce anyone who, and I quote, composes, transcribes, prints, sells, buys, carries, donates, lends, receives, possesses, hides, reads, or listens to books or other heretical writings. So they're not leaving anything to chance. So trial records offer us a chance to one we come across almost nowhere else in the available evidence from this period, offer us a chance to hear directly from readers at the very lowest levels of society, the poor, the very uneducated, women. Their words are taken down verbatim by a scribe, even in some cases, as this trial record from Loreto that I've been working on, their screams as they submit to torture, which are recorded with a cold literalness by the scribe on the pages of the trial testimony. These are quite difficult texts to navigate, partly because of their emotional impact, also because their status as historical fact really comes under strain. And this is something that Natalie Zeman-Davis has keenly articulated in a famous work called Fiction in the Archives. So as a literary student, I've been very alert to the difficulties of working with these kinds of records, their shifting realities, the deep unreliability of the narratorial voice when submitting to torture or terror or authority. The juxtaposition linguistically on the page between the cool Latin questions of the inquisitor and the garbled or inarticulate dialect responses of the terrified witnesses. Trial records offer us occasional and partial access to the experience of readers, but only, of course, those who have gone wrong. So I'm going to start to draw to a conclusion, and I'll come back to an image of Vittoria Colonna, a much more beautiful one this time. This is an altarpiece from the island of Ischia, where she spent her early married life, and you can see her on the bottom right, herself notably holding a book, performing her own relationship, presumably to devotional reading, which seems very fitting. So where have we arrived? The first thing to say, quite obvious, but worth restating, is that the material I've been presenting this evening has been almost exclusively devotional, and that's because this was the direction of travel that Vittoria Colonna's work set me on, but also because, as has become clear, when ordinary people became readers, they did so in the main with a concrete end in view, a desire to be changed, protected, improved, saved by a devotional text, a text that they might endeavor to read, that they might simply hold or wear or stand close to if they were allowed. There are other kinds of genres in which a similar approach might bear some interesting fruit. The BSR is lucky enough to have a large collection of early guidebooks spanning the period 1500 to 1800, many collected by the director at the beginning of the last century, Thomas Ashby, who mined them for their topographical data, and then with the collection more recently increased thanks to a generous donation. This is very suggestive material. Virginia Reinberg describes books of hours as archives of prayer. Thanks to the good offices of my colleagues here at the BSR, Claire Hornsby and Beatrice Gelosia, to whom warm thanks for taking me to see them, I've been alerted that some of the guidebooks in our collections are, in essence, archives of travel and pilgrimage. So books that mediate itineraries that help an individual, usually a Christian, in the very earliest cases, to access and absorb a city, its sacred roots, its sacred spaces around Rome, heavily annotated by these original readers as they move through the city. So I'm hoping to carve out some time. Now is the time to start, 1 year in, to begin thinking about how some early pilgrim readers, traveler readers, read their texts in this highly activated way to navigate and record and be changed by an encounter with Rome. And where have I arrived at personally at the end of all this? I guess I'm still a literary student. I may be no closer to being able to find the right tick box on a grant application, but I think I've decided that it probably doesn't matter. I am certainly somewhere much messier, more applied, more engaged, more a kind of concrete than I would have expected to be when I set out on my doctoral studies, reading Vittoria Colonna. I didn't expect her to bring me here, but now that I understand her better, it makes perfect sense. And I have to say that it's somewhere I'm really happy to be, because texts always demand to be read, and trying to recapture the horizon of expectations of their original readers is a wonderful voyage of discovery. And also, happily, thanks to this new environment at the BSR and the support of my colleagues, I find myself with a new departure in sight. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. What a whirlwind journey through 20 years, or is that rude to say?
Maybe a bit more.
And I'm loving how your perspectives are broadening, and you're taking so much away from your time here already, especially now that you're thinking archaeologically, which I'm particularly proud of. We've got some time for questions, so please, those in the audience, do raise your hand if you have one, and those online, feel free to type them into the Q&A box. While our audience is ruminating, I thought I would begin with a question, which is probably more related to your first year here and all these new experiences you're having, rather than most of what you just talked about. But that is that being here in this very particular community where we're exposed to so many disciplines and so many experiences and so many activities, and especially now that you're thinking and using archaeological evidence, what have you taken away to apply to future research? What new methods and approaches and perspectives are you keen to jump into next?
That's easy. Digging. Digging big holes and climbing into them. But I mean that kind of seriously. I think that's the methodology, is digging in the unprepossessing areas and discovering like traces of evidence, and then learning how to take those hypothetical leaps. I think what I've learned from colleagues here, and what I've been finding really exciting in the last year, is a kind of intellectual boldness, which I think is part and parcel of the archaeology discipline, but also of others, of being able to take the most kind of partial evidence and jump somewhere new with it without apologizing for that intellectual jump. And I think it's really refreshing, and I think it's really important. And it's probably partly because I'm older now and I care less and I'm more confident that I feel able to do that. But I wish I'd done it earlier, especially, I have to say, working, on women from the Renaissance period, where the evidence is so partial and you're always gathering little scraps and pulling them together and trying to build a picture. And at a certain point, it's like, basta, I'm not going to find any more. I just have to say something about what I've got. So I think that's what I'm taking away. I love the interdisciplinary dialogue here, and the way that it kind of empowers you to look at how another discipline might interpret evidence that seems different from yours, but can be comparable, and just try that and see what happens. So yeah, that's what I'm enjoying.
Brilliant. And so much of what you talked about then also just kept me thinking about antiquity and the classical world, diversity in literature, diversity in literacy, and stuff like that. Right, questions. Who's got a question in the audience? Down the front, Luca, first up.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I was going to ask, when you speak of the democratization of texts, have you come across anything remotely similar to what Carlo Ginzburg has in his Il formaggio vermi, in terms of Menocchio sort of synthesizing and analyzing various texts and coming up with his own sort of theoretical understanding of those texts?
I wish I had come across anything as compelling and extraordinary as the records that Carlo Ginzburg used in that study. Obviously, that's a really formative study for anyone who works in this field, and a beautiful kind of methodological enactment of what you can do with this unexpected material. And I think he probably set in train, you know, a whole lot of archival activity with that text. We're all in his debt for. I think he was very lucky. He wasn't lucky, he was very skillful, but what he uncovered was something which was synthetic and broad enough that he could, you know, use a single case study. I've always found that I'm using scraps of individual evidence. The trial record that I showed you from Loreto is one that I'd like to do more work with in a more sustained way at some point. But I think what he uncovered is exactly what's happening all over the place. I mean, he's pointing to the phenomenon that I'm then kind of catching up with from a slightly different perspective. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Luca. We've got two at the back middle.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating lecture. I'd like to ask just something. You spoke mostly about lay women and their spirituality and their reading. I immediately thought of nuns, and of course they not only used books for their prayer, but also they had reading every meal. And a former Colonna, Cardinal Giacomo Colonna in the late 13th century, when they were setting up the Poor Clare convent here in Rome in San Silvestro, suggested that not only should the sisters listen to texts being read at meals, but they should listen to texts being sung at meals. And it's sort of interesting too that some of these early nuns sometimes came to the convent without any knowledge of reading. And some of the rules say things like, if a woman comes before she's 20 and she doesn't know how to read, teach her to read. If she's older, she doesn't have to learn. So I wonder if you have done anything about the kind of convents and literature and their books.
So there's a lot of wonderful work on convents, probably not by me, but by colleagues of mine. And you're absolutely right. And I think probably one of the reasons why I have not engaged so directly with convents is because that's where we expect to find literate communities of readers. And I guess I was kind of interested in contexts in which that sort of institutional support for the presence and consumption of text was absent, and thinking about how text might function outside those communities. I have done some work on the secular literature that sort of is used in and around convents. So particularly interestingly, the way that lyric poetry as a sort of sociable genre, as a genre of sociability, of networking, of making connections in a community is harnessed and used to celebrate the entries of nuns into convents, and how the whole community kind of turns out and writes poems. And you even find occasions where the poems are hung around the streets as the procession moves through, and they're read aloud at the feasting. But these are secular poems. These are poems in the lyric tradition that are kind of, the work I wrote on it was called On the Convent Threshold, because it's where the sort of secular then gets left behind. There is actually a nun in Bologna who continues to write Petrarchan lyric poetry from within her convent, seemingly with the support of her abbess. But you're absolutely right that convents are places where devotional reading takes place. And there's been some amazing work done on the inventories of convent libraries through the period as well, to find out what books nuns actually had access to, often the collections that they brought in with them, rather than a sort of institutional library per se. And that is very interesting because you find all kinds of books that they really shouldn't have, you know, Ariosto and Boccaccio, and things that they should have left on entry. That one, Annotated Meditations, I suppose, was somewhere where I strayed into a convent because the nuns were declaring themselves, and it's such a beautiful example. So Alessia, the reader of that copy I briefly showed you, has annotated that whole text really heavily, including inscribing some poems about herself in the back, and then her friend Teofila has kind of maybe been given the book on her death, or so. I like the idea of these. I was very interested in the idea of somebody's personal possession, their own book, still being a feature of their life in an institutional context where presumably you were supposed to give that up. But there is a very rich literature on convent women. I suppose Vittoria Colonna per se led me down the secular route. Although she really wanted to join a convent, she wasn't allowed. She was prevented by the Pope, I think, in the hopes that she would make another politically advantageous marriage, which she refused to do. And she spent a lot of her life in convents, but always as a sort of secular guest, just staying. So clearly that was the room of one's own in this period where you could read and write and be a woman. Yeah.
Just in front now to Margaret.
Thank you. I thought it was a really fascinating lecture. And I, as a visual artist, I loved all the visuals, or how you were interpreting the visuals, you know, the annotations in the book. I don't have a question, I just have a comment about when you're talking about times when people were forbidden to write or read, and the whole idea of the use of text, or the ability to read and write as a political and social tool. And, you know, they think that they say one of the reasons the Europeans were so easily able to conquer the Americas was because they were illiterate. The people leading the conquest were literate, and the Native Americans didn't have a literature tradition to communicate with each other the way the Europeans did. But also was bringing it right to like dystopian future. And, you know, The Handmaid's Tale, the women were forbidden to read, or their hands were cut off. So I just think it's this whole trajectory of the use of text and writing as a and it was so clearly with the scribing of the trials. You know, they were the people with the power to write and record. Yeah. So I thought that was really fascinating.
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. And hearing the beauty of the BSR, that somebody comes from a different disciplinary perspective with those comments. I had a lovely conversation the other evening in the foyer with some newly arrived residents who were talking about, we were comparing my period with the invention of print as a kind of cataclysmic and really, you know, extraordinary moment of technological advance with what's currently happening on social media and how young people interact with text. And maybe it's not text anymore, maybe it's video or image. Unfortunately, I'm too much of a dinosaur to be able to work on this because I think it's fascinating. And I think there are some really interesting thinking about moments of technological shift and then readers navigating those spaces, I think is really exciting. So there's probably some work to do on now that I'm not equipped to do, but somebody 20 years younger than me will have to take on.
May I? Yes, I felt tantalized at the beginning when you talked about the question of what was it in Vittoria Colonna's work that was so compelling. And then you veered off into the other pamphlets and brochures, but didn't come back around to what is the content in her work that appealed to the commoner.
Okay, yes, I did veer off. You're right, because I was wary of too much literary analysis in this particular context. But there are lots of wonderful answers to that question in lots of wonderful recent work by all kinds of people, you know, beyond and including me. I think that one of the things that she did very successfully was model a trajectory. So she modeled a way of inhabiting a kind of devotional frame that seemed imitable and accessible. Her poetry is very beautiful. And it was ubiquitous. So I suppose that if you're hearing it sung, then you want to also see it read. This is a question. I mean, what is it about Colonna that's so good? You have to read her and see. But I think she's taken the lyric genre in a completely new direction that probably only in the last 10 years we've really got a handle on how innovative her use of the genre was. And that's partly by inhabiting it as a woman, but it's mostly by turning it devotional. So she takes a really well-known and well-practiced genre and applies it to something. I think that's the key. She was very interested in the new discussions around new forms of spirituality. She was interested in sola fide, in kind of Lutheran doctrine and its potential, in this idea that you inhabit a faith and then you just kind of are wide open. Your fate is already decided before your birth. You're wide open and you let things happen to you. And I think that is being enacted in her poetry in a really exciting way. Then, of course, she dies just as those conversations become impossible. And, you know, that particular doctrinal approach becomes impossible. So I think there are probably lots of answers to that. Next time I'll give a lecture on her. I won't apologize for her anymore, no.
We've probably got time for another couple of questions. Yes. Right.
Thank you so much. A wonderful and exciting talk. I wanted to take you back to where you showed the pamphlet from your trip to Padova and that chap who put her name at the top, and that kind of seemed odd. But I was wondering, because you kind of started to ask the question, it sort of fits with what's just been said about sort of invocation of Vittoria Colonna in that context. Could it have been because of her widowed status, how she didn't then make another marriage because she spent a lot of time in convents, that she had a kind of celebrity as a sort of halfway to being a saint while she was still alive? So it was her personal devoutness, which she expressed in her beautiful, as you've described them, devotional poems, that kind of made it like an inspiration for other people. And so he's using her as a, you know, her personal nature is not described by what he says. All he has to do is say her name, and then people know, oh, she's that amazing, beautiful Duchess who is friends with everybody and has got so much money, but this is what she writes and it's so holy, right? Yeah,
absolutely absolutely that. And from the very first editions of her poetry, La Diva, La Divina, that's how she's described. And on the frontispiece I showed you from the 1540 edition, where she's basically in prayer, but I mean, it's not her, but the image is what looks like a nun in prayer before a crucifix. Absolutely that. But what's really interesting is that pamphlet is published in 1538. That's the same year as the first edition of her poetry. Is it that first edition was printed and immediately her fame, or if not, how was that image of? So the really interesting thing that I haven't worked out yet is, how did people already know that about her before her poetry is circulating in print? That's the question that I haven't quite got to grips with. I don't think any of us have quite, but yes, absolutely, her star power. And then the reverberations of that are enormous and incredibly helpful to subsequent secular women who want to write, because they don't have to be as perfect and pious and admirable as her, because she's created a space which they can then move into. So although the immediate followers of her into the literary arena write lyric poetry in a devotional frame, it's not long before they can start to write all kinds of other things, because in a sense she's established such an impermeable kind of space for women. And then of course literary tastes and fashions follow the developments through the 16th century, and actually devotional matter is the matter of literature. So she's also already writing in the way that will become the way to write in the later century, I think. But yeah, that's absolutely it.
One more question up to the back.
Thank you for this very inspiring lecture. I'll continue a little bit with the kind of from the art historical side. I'm also very interested in the pictorial annotations that you showed. It seems that at least you showed two different cases. I think with the communal reading example of pictorial annotation, it's quite clear that we can probably say that these images are mnemonic, in the sense that kind of as a marker, the visual mnemonic device for kind of consumption of text. And then the other case where it's kind of more personal doodling that seems irrelevant to the text. But I wonder, because it's repetitive and it's the same smiley face, whether it could also act mnemonically, that then there is a kind of function to the reading itself. But that's also hypothetical. And then I'm also very interested in some of the some of the jewelries that you showed with text. And I wonder, but now I can't think of anything. But then with the nuns eating meals, I'm also thinking, like, do we have examples of text on decorative objects or domestic objects? Now I can't think of any. I know in later centuries, there are like nursery rhymes on plates, but I wonder if there are other things that, you know, might be helpful to think about reading, but not through the medium of print, but through other
Absolutely. And this is one of the things we did in the project in Cambridge. In fact, we filled the Fitzwilliam Museum with domestic objects with devotional text and symbols, especially the IHS is a clear example of a text that has just immediately a kind of function in the bottom of your soup bowl. So you drink your soup and there it is, you see it, or in your mug. So you finish your beer and there it is, you see it, or on the knives. We found a beautiful set of table knives that have been studied by a colleague called Flora Dennis, who's on our faculty, in fact, which have the text of the prayer to be sung and also the musical notation of the different parts, so that you can stand around the table and perform sing your prayer before you sit down to eat. Obviously, those are very high end. I think the difference in my work is that those objects tend to be luxury objects. What the printed text is the bottom end of that. It's like, how can you reproduce that cheaply? So my colleagues dealt with those beautiful things, and I scrabbled around with the breve. To come back to your other point about mnemonic devices, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting to think about those little faces. I hadn't thought about that. What you often find as well is the poetry is marked in the margins with marks that would suggest maybe how you would recite it. So I think it's being voiced aloud. Maybe you're breathing there. Maybe you're pausing. So the marginal marks don't look like they're directing you to a particular bit of the poem, but perhaps just, you know, breaking it down for you so that you can read it nicely. Also because often, you know, in the best kind of Petrarchan lyric, there'll be an enjambement and the sense will run on, and you have to be able not to breathe at the end of the line, but breathe later on. So there's a clear activation of the text in the marginalia as well. I didn't show you those because they're less exciting to look at, but yes, I think that's absolutely what's going on. Yeah.
We've got time for probably one more question before we let Abby take a breath.
Do we need to?
Thank you so much, Abby. That was very interesting. I have one question just that ties on to what she had. I was wondering if, you know, there's the fantasy that Vittorio Colonna and Tullio d'Aragona were both in Ferrara in 1537 listening to Occhino. I wonder if you've ever delved into the archives in Ferrara.
So my colleague Veronica Coppello is the person to answer that, because she has found all kinds of letters, new letters, that tell us an awful lot more. She was definitely in Ferrara, and poetry was read, and Occhino was listened to. I haven't done it, but Veronica has. But whether they met or not, I find that hard to imagine. She was terribly, terribly correct, and Tullio d'Aragona was not. So I think she would have been too scandalized to be in the same room personally.
Okay, we might wrap up there. Thank you also to our online audience. Joe, I can see that you've put a question there, and I know that Abby will get back to you. But one last time, can we please all thank Abby so much for her 1-year anniversary lecture.